A farmer weighed down by years of hardship and failing crops. Desperation leads him to pray for a sign that never comes, until it does. Strange red eggs appear in his barn, glowing with an eerie light. As the eggs hatch, an unexpected miracle begins, guiding him toward faith and renewal. Jacob Bennett sat on the worn-out rocking chair outside his modest farmhouse, staring out at the fields. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the hills, casting a golden hue over the land. But Jacob didn't see beauty anymore. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and the weight of the world hung over him like a dark cloud. He had been a farmer all his life, working the land with the same hands that had once held hope. But now those hands were calloused and bruised from years of toil that seemed to lead nowhere. At 52, Jacob had seen his fair share of hardships, but nothing had prepared him for the crushing weight of failure he felt now. The crops he had so carefully nurtured had withered away in the scorching heat. The once verdant fields were now patches of dry earth, cracked and desolate. He had tried everything, different seeds, new irrigation methods, prayers, but nothing seemed to work. His debts had piled up, and every creditor's letter that came in the mail felt like a nail in his coffin. There was no escape from the grim reality of his life. The farm, the very thing that had given him purpose for over 30 years, was slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to stop it. Jacob had been raised on this land, the son of a proud farmer who had taught him to love the earth. Back then, the soil seemed to hum with life, the fields always rich with crops, the barn full of animals. His father had spoken of the land as though it was a gift, something to nurture and protect. Jacob had always believed in that. He had worked hard, shoulder to the plow, day in and day out, taking pride in the harvest he brought in. There was nothing more fulfilling than seeing the fruits of his labor, knowing he had built something with his own hands. But that was a long time ago. The land had begun to change, and so had Jacob. The first signs of trouble came slowly, almost imperceptibly. The rain stopped coming as often, the crops began to wilt earlier in the season, and the once abundant wildlife seemed to disappear. Jacob had watched with growing dread as his father's old advice, "Work with the land and it will reward you," began to feel like empty words. In the early years of the decline, he fought back. He borrowed money, bought new equipment, and tried to reinvent his methods. He worked late into the night, pushing himself harder than ever. But the harder he worked, the more elusive success became. The debts mounted, and with each passing season, Jacob felt the tightening grip of despair around his chest. There were days when he stood in the fields, looking out over the land he had once known so well, and wondered if it was worth all the effort. The land didn't seem to care anymore. The weight of his failures was starting to suffocate him. His wife, Clara, had left a few years ago, unable to endure the constant strain of the farm's decline. She had been a pillar of support, but even she had come to believe that there was no future here. When she left, Jacob felt a loneliness deeper than any he had known before. His only company was the silence of the fields and the occasional visits from his son, Peter, who had moved to the city to escape the weight of the farm's decline. Jacob didn't blame Peter. He understood. The city offered opportunities, a chance for a life that wasn't tied to the land, a life that could flourish while his own seemed to be dying. But Peter's visits had become fewer and fewer, and now Jacob only saw him on holidays, when the city's bustle could be put aside for a few hours of family time. Even then, it was clear that Peter had long since accepted that the farm was no longer a place to build a future. The old house and the barn were nothing more than reminders of what once was. In the stillness of the evening, Jacob could feel the isolation wrapping itself around him. He would go to bed each night with the weight of worry pressing down on him, his mind racing with thoughts of what he had lost and what was slipping away. The farm, his family, his dignity. He felt like a man adrift in a storm, unable to find solid ground. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Jacob's thoughts turned inward. His mind drifted to the days when things had been different. He remembered the early years of his marriage to Clara, when they had worked together side by side on the farm. He remembered how their hands had touched in the quiet moments after a long day's work, how they had dreamed together of a future where their children would take over the land, carrying on the tradition of farming. But those dreams had long since faded. Now all that was left was a sinking feeling of regret and longing. That evening, Jacob found himself standing in the middle of his barn, staring at the few animals left. The goats that still grazed, the chickens that laid the last of their eggs. The barn smelled of hay and earth, and the silence was deafening. Jacob's heart ached as he looked at the fading light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. The barn had always been a place of refuge for him, a place where he could retreat from the outside world and lose himself in the simple tasks of feeding the animals and cleaning the stalls. But now even the barn felt like a prison. Jacob's body was tired, and his spirit was even more so. He sank to his knees in the middle of the barn, his head heavy with the weight of his struggles.
I can't do this anymore.
He whispered to the empty space, his voice raw with exhaustion.
I need help. Please show me a sign.
For a long time, Jacob sat there in the quiet, his mind empty except for the desperate plea that echoed in his heart. He had no answers, no way forward, just the overwhelming need for something, anything, that would give him hope again. And then in the silence of the barn, he closed his eyes and waited, not knowing what to expect, but desperately longing for something to change. The evening was unusually still, the kind of quiet that felt heavy in the air. The sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the world bathed in the soft shadows of dusk. Jacob had finished his chores for the day, his muscles aching, and his mind clouded with the same familiar worries. He had given up on hope a long time ago, but something about this evening felt different. As he trudged toward the barn to check on the few animals that remained, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. He pushed open the barn door, its rusty hinges creaking in protest. The smell of hay and earth filled his nostrils, and for a moment he could almost imagine the barn was as it used to be, a lively place full of life, laughter, and promise. But that memory was fleeting, swallowed by the harsh reality of the present. The barn was quiet now, just the faint rustle of animals in their stalls. Jacob was about to turn toward the far corner where the goats were kept when his eyes fell on something unusual. There, in the center of the barn's dirt floor, lay a cluster of eggs. But these weren't the dull brown or white eggs he was used to seeing. These eggs were different, bright red, their color so vivid that they almost seemed to pulse with life. Jacob blinked, unsure of what he was seeing. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the straw as he knelt down to get a better look. The eggs were smooth, their shells a deep, almost unnatural shade of crimson. They weren't large, but they were certainly unlike anything Jacob had ever seen before. He reached out tentatively, running his hand over the warm surface of one of the eggs. There was an odd, almost electric sensation that passed through his fingers, a feeling of something alive beneath the shell. At first, Jacob thought they must have come from some unknown animal, perhaps a wild bird or an odd creature that had wandered into the barn. Maybe it was just a strange, random occurrence. But the more he stared at the eggs, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deliberate about their presence. He sat back on his heels, still watching the eggs. His heart began to race, a strange mixture of curiosity and unease rising within him. There was something about these eggs that didn't sit right, something that felt almost magical. He had spent years working the land, and in all that time, he had never seen anything like this. A flicker of doubt passed through his mind. Maybe it was nothing, just an odd coincidence. After all, life on the farm had been full of strange, unexpected events over the years. But then again, he had prayed for a sign. Was this it? Was this what he had asked for? What he had desperately hoped would come? Jacob stood up, taking a few steps back, his eyes never leaving the eggs. The barn felt colder now, as though the very air had shifted in response to this strange discovery. He couldn't help but feel that he was standing on the edge of something he didn't fully understand, something far beyond his control. The eggs seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, their red shells shimmering as if they were alive. The glow wasn't bright, but it was undeniable. It was as though the eggs themselves were emitting an otherworldly energy, casting an eerie, soft light across the barn. Jacob took a deep breath, his mind racing. Could this be the sign he had prayed for? Could these eggs, with their strange glow and unnatural color, be the answer to his desperate plea for help? He felt a shiver run down his spine. A part of him wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to some passing fancy, some trick of the light. But another part of him, the part that had been holding on to the faintest thread of hope, couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward them. He slowly crouched down again, this time with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered above the eggs. A strange calm washed over him, almost as if the eggs themselves were inviting him to touch them, to take care of them. Jacob hesitated for a moment, torn between skepticism and a growing sense of belief. He had spent so many years doubting, so many years wondering if God had abandoned him. And yet, here he was, standing in front of something that could only be described as miraculous. Was this a test? A sign that his prayers had been heard? His mind churned with questions. But as his fingers finally made contact with one of the eggs, the warmth that radiated from it soothed his racing thoughts. Jacob let out a breath, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace settle over him. For the first time in months, he felt something stir inside of him, a glimmer of hope, however faint.
Maybe.
He whispered to the stillness of the barn.
This is what I've been waiting for.
But as quickly as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in again. Could these eggs truly be a divine sign, or was he simply imagining things? Jacob didn't know. He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that these eggs, with their strange glow and inexplicable presence, were now a part of his life. And for the first time in a long while, he couldn't help but wonder if they were the answer to his prayers. With a deep sigh, Jacob carefully gathered the eggs, cradling them gently in his hands. He wasn't sure what it all meant, or where this strange discovery would lead, but something in him told him to care for them, to protect them as he had once done for the farm that had brought him so much pride. And so, with the faint glow of the eggs lighting his path, Jacob carried them back to his home, uncertain of what the future would hold, but filled with the faintest flicker of hope. For days after Jacob found the red eggs, he watched over them with a mixture of awe and curiosity. He placed them in a small basket in the warmth of his kitchen, where he could keep an eye on them. As the days passed, he could feel the subtle change in the air, an electricity he couldn't explain. The eggs remained warm to the touch, their faint glow slowly dimming, but Jacob felt an odd sense of expectation building within him. It was as though the barn, the farm, even the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then one morning, just as the sun's first light filtered through the kitchen window, it happened. A tiny crack appeared in the shell of one of the eggs. Jacob sat up, his heart racing as he leaned in closer. The crack widened, and soon a small beak pushed through the opening, followed by the rest of a tiny, fragile body. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he watched the chick emerge. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The chick was small, no larger than the palm of his hand, but its feathers were shimmering, golden and iridescent, catching the light in a way that was almost magical. Its tiny wings fluttered weakly, and it let out a soft, high-pitched chirp. Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of wonder fill him, and for a moment all of his troubles, all of his doubts, seemed to vanish in the presence of this little creature. Soon the other eggs began to crack open, one by one. Jacob watched in awe as the remaining chicks emerged, each with golden feathers that gleamed in the early morning light. Their tiny bodies were delicate, but there was something profoundly beautiful about them, something that made Jacob's heart swell with a mixture of astonishment and reverence. He had raised chickens before, but nothing like this. These chicks weren't ordinary. They were something else entirely. As the last of the eggs hatched, Jacob carefully moved the chicks into a warm, soft bed of hay in a small box he had set up. He watched them closely, marveling at the way they moved, quiet, serene, and almost unnaturally gentle. They didn't make the usual fuss that young birds did. Instead, they were calm, almost wise in their movements, as though they understood the world in a way that was far beyond their years. Jacob felt a strange connection to them, an instinctual bond that tugged at his heart. He found himself spending more and more time in the barn, sitting quietly beside the chicks, watching them grow. Their golden feathers shimmered in the light, and they moved with a quiet grace, pecking gently at the ground or napping in the warmth of the hay. There was something about them that felt divine. It was as if they were not simply creatures of this world, but something sent from another place, something meant for something greater. As the days went by, Jacob's wonder only deepened. The chicks grew quickly, their feathers becoming more brilliant with each passing day. Their golden plumage didn't dull in the way feathers typically did as birds grew older. Instead, it remained as radiant and vibrant as the day they hatched, their small forms still perfect, still shimmering with an ethereal light. Jacob couldn't help but wonder if they were special in some way. He had never heard of any bird, let alone a chicken, that glowed with such beauty. But there was more to it than just their appearance. There was a presence about them, an energy that he couldn't quite place but felt in his bones. It was as if the chicks were more than ordinary animals. They seemed to carry an air of wisdom, of something greater than himself. He often found himself sitting in silence, just watching them, waiting for something to happen. In the quiet moments, he would catch himself thinking that these chicks were the answer to the questions he had been asking for so long. Could they be a sign from God, a gift? Or were they simply a strange coincidence, the product of his own desperation? Jacob didn't have answers. He couldn't explain the glow, the beauty, or the sense of wonder he felt when he looked at them. But one thing was clear. These chicks were no ordinary birds. There was something extraordinary about them, and as their golden feathers continued to shine, Jacob couldn't help but believe that they were meant for something greater, just as he was. The days following the hatching of the golden chicks brought Jacob a sense of wonder he hadn't felt in years. He had always been a man of faith, but the difficulties he had faced over the past few years had shaken that faith. Now, with the chicks in his care, he felt a quiet hope stirring deep inside him. He had no idea what these birds meant or why they had appeared in his life, but every day he spent with them, he felt the weight of his loneliness and despair begin to lift, if only slightly. But the real miracle began the day the well ran dry. Jacob had always relied on the well to irrigate his crops. It had been a steady source of water for as long as he could remember, but the dry spell had stretched on for months, and the water level had been dropping steadily. He had hoped that the rains would come soon, but as the days grew hotter, the earth cracked and dried beneath his feet, and he realized that the well might be running out for good. Without water, his crops would surely perish, and his last hope of saving the farm would be gone. One late afternoon, as Jacob walked through the fields, his heart heavy with the thought of what was to come, he heard a soft cluck behind him. He turned to see the chicks, now a little larger, their golden feathers glistening in the fading light, gathered at the edge of the barn, pecking at the ground. They chirped quietly to one another, but Jacob was too absorbed in his worries to pay them much attention. Yet as he watched them from a distance, something unusual happened. The chicks suddenly stopped pecking and turned toward the woods at the far edge of the property. They raised their heads, looking intently at something just beyond the trees. Without a sound, they began to move, walking in unison, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Jacob stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The chicks had never acted like this before. They were always calm and serene, but now they seemed purposeful, as if they had a destination in mind. Unable to shake the feeling that something important was happening, Jacob followed them. He moved slowly at first, unsure of what to expect, but the chicks led him with unerring certainty. As they walked deeper into the woods, Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He had never ventured this far into the woods before, and he wasn't sure what lay ahead. But the chicks, those strange, beautiful creatures, seemed to know exactly where they were going. After what seemed like an eternity, the chicks led him to a small clearing at the base of a hill. Jacob stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in disbelief. There, at the foot of the hill, was a spring, an underground stream that had been hidden for as long as Jacob could remember. The water bubbled up from the ground, clear and pure, flowing steadily into a small pool. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea how this spring had remained hidden all these years, but there it was, a source of water that could save his farm. The chicks wandered to the edge of the spring and began to drink, their golden feathers reflecting in the water's surface. Jacob stood there for a long time, his mind reeling. He had been on the brink of losing everything, and now, thanks to the chicks, he had found a new source of life-giving water. His crops could be saved. His farm could be saved. In the days that followed, Jacob used the water from the spring to irrigate his crops. The difference was immediate. The plants that had been wilting and dying slowly began to revive, their leaves turning green again, their stems straightening toward the sky. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, and Jacob couldn't help but marvel at how the chicks had led him to the very thing he needed. But the miracles didn't stop there. As the chicks grew stronger and more active, Jacob noticed that they seemed to have an uncanny ability to guide him in other ways. He had always prided himself on his knowledge of farming, but lately his methods had seemed to fail him. He had planted crops in the usual patterns, rotating fields and following traditional methods, but something wasn't working. Yet every time he watched the chicks move around the fields, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were showing him something. One afternoon, as he watched them dart between rows of corn, Jacob noticed something strange. The chicks, with their bright golden feathers, seemed drawn to one particular area of the field. They were pecking at the ground and chirping excitedly, as if there was something they wanted him to see. Curious, Jacob walked over to the spot and began to dig. To his astonishment, he uncovered a patch of soil that was rich and dark, much more fertile than the surrounding earth. The soil seemed to glisten with life, and as he touched it, he realized that this was the perfect place to plant a new crop. It was an area he had never considered before, but the chicks had led him to it. Following their example, Jacob planted a new variety of beans, one he had never tried, and tended to the soil with a renewed sense of purpose. Weeks later, the beans grew faster and healthier than anything he had ever seen before. They thrived in that small patch of land, yielding a bountiful harvest when the rest of the crop struggled in the harsh conditions. It was as if the chicks knew exactly where the best soil was, guiding Jacob to plant where the land would yield the most. As Jacob's farm began to recover, so too did his spirit. The chicks, with their golden feathers and calm, knowing presence, had brought him not only physical salvation, but emotional healing. He found himself spending more time with them, sitting in the barn, watching their gentle movements, and allowing their serene energy to soothe his troubled mind. They were never demanding, never loud, always content in their own quiet way, and Jacob began to feel a deep sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. Late one evening, as he sat on the porch watching the chicks play in the yard, Jacob reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the day he had found the eggs, the way they had hatched in his care, the miraculous discovery of the spring, and the unexpected guidance they had provided for his crops. He had always believed in God, but now more than ever, he felt certain that these birds were not simply a strange coincidence. They were a sign. God had sent them to him, to guide him when he was lost, to heal him when he was broken. Jacob had asked for help, and somehow, in a way he never could have imagined, the answer had come, soft, golden, and full of life. As the days passed, Jacob grew more attuned to the golden chicks. At first, he had been focused on their miraculous qualities, how they had led him to the spring, how they helped his crops thrive. But soon he realized the chicks were teaching him deeper lessons. Their calm, unhurried movements were a stark contrast to his frantic efforts to save the farm. Jacob, always a man of action, had spent years trying to control everything, but the chicks' peaceful nature made him reconsider his approach. They seemed to live in the moment, trusting that their needs would be met without struggle. Jacob, in contrast, had spent too many years worrying about the future and trying to fix every problem on his own. He had forgotten how to trust, both in the natural rhythms of life and in God's timing. The chicks, by simply existing, showed him that there was another way, a way of trust, patience, and stillness. As he watched them, Jacob began to wonder if he had been going about his life all wrong. He reflected on the years of struggle when his faith had faltered. When things had started going wrong on the farm, he had turned inward, relying solely on his own strength. But now, as he watched the chicks move with such ease and confidence, he realized that his earlier attempts to fix everything on his own had only made him more anxious. The birds, with their simple presence, reminded him that life was not something to be controlled. It was something to be trusted. Jacob remembered how he had once believed in God's timing, trusting that everything had a purpose. But as his farm faltered, His belief had slipped. He had tried to solve every problem himself, feeling abandoned by God when nothing seemed to work. Yet now, in the quiet company of the chicks, Jacob felt the stirrings of a deep change in his heart. He began to see that the bird's guidance wasn't just about saving his crops, it was about guiding him back to faith, back to trusting God's plan. He thought about the day he had prayed for a sign, asking for help. The chicks, golden and serene, had appeared as that answer, not just in the form of physical miracles, but also as a reminder of how to live with faith. Jacob realized that the peace he had been searching for wasn't found in his ability to fix everything. It was found in surrendering, in trusting that God's timing was enough. Sitting on the porch one evening, Jacob watched the chicks gather together for the night, their golden feathers glowing in the soft light. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. His heart softened as he embraced the lessons of patience, trust, and stillness. The chicks had shown him that his worth wasn't in his ability to control life, but in his ability to trust in God's guidance. With that trust, Jacob felt a renewed sense of purpose and peace, knowing that no matter what came next, he could face it with faith. As the weeks passed, the chicks began to change in ways that both fascinated and mystified Jacob. Their once soft, golden feathers had transformed into shimmering, iridescent plumage that seemed to glow in the sunlight, a brilliance that felt almost otherworldly. They no longer clung to the barn, nor did they need Jacob's care in the same way they once had. Instead, the birds began to fly across the farm, exploring its expanse with a grace and freedom that left Jacob in awe. The birds' growing independence was a quiet reminder that their time with him was coming to an end. Jacob noticed that, while they still seemed to seek his company, they no longer relied on him for food or shelter. They had grown stronger, their wings more powerful, their presence less tethered to the ground. At first, Jacob had felt a slight pang of concern. After all, they had come to him in his time of need, and now they seemed to be preparing for something greater, something beyond his reach. Then one morning, Jacob woke up to the sight of the birds standing together at the edge of the farm, their wings spread wide as though ready for flight. The morning air was still, and the rising sun cast a soft glow on the birds' glowing feathers, making them appear like celestial beings. Jacob's heart tightened as he realized that the moment he had been dreading had arrived. The birds were preparing to leave. He felt a deep sense of finality wash over him, mixed with an unexpected sadness. For so long, these golden creatures had been his companions, guiding him through the hardest time of his life, teaching him to trust, to have faith, to let go. They had been more than just birds to him. They had been a tangible connection to God's grace, to the divine wisdom he had once lost touch with. And now they were leaving, flying off to whatever destiny awaited them. The farm, the land, the air, all would feel emptier without their presence. Jacob stood at the window of his house watching the birds as they took a final, sweeping flight across the fields, their wings cutting through the morning light like rays of hope. His emotions swelled, sadness, gratitude, awe, and he realized in that moment how much they had changed him. The lessons the birds had imparted were not just practical, but spiritual. They had shown him what it meant to trust without question, to accept the flow of life without constantly trying to control it. They had reminded him of the importance of patience and of surrender, of knowing that sometimes the best thing to do was nothing at all, just to wait and have faith. As the birds soared higher into the sky, Jacob felt a lump form in his throat. He had expected to feel abandoned, to feel as though he had been left behind in the same way he had often felt in his life. But instead, what he felt was an overwhelming sense of gratitude and peace. The birds had come to him at a time when he was lost, when he had given up hope, and they had guided him back to the path of faith. Their time together had been short, but it had been filled with meaning and transformation. A few moments later, Jacob stepped outside. The air was still, the morning light soft and golden, and for the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The birds were gone, but their lessons remained. Jacob knew that they had not left him empty-handed. Their departure marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, a chapter where he could continue to live with the same trust and peace that they had taught him. As the birds faded into the horizon, Jacob stood silently, watching them disappear into the sky. His heart felt full, and as the wind brushed gently against his skin, he whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. The birds had not just helped him save his farm, they had helped him rediscover his faith, his purpose, and his connection to the divine. And now, with a heart full of gratitude, Jacob knew that he was ready to face whatever came next, with the same faith and trust that the birds had shown him. As the birds disappeared into the sky, Jacob stood alone, overwhelmed by emotion. Tears flowed from his eyes, not from sorrow, but from a deep sense of gratitude. He had spent so many years consumed by worry and the weight of his struggles, trying to fix everything on his own. But now, with the birds gone, he understood that the true miracle wasn't in their presence, but in how they had helped him rediscover his faith and purpose. The birds had taught him profound lessons about faith, patience, and resilience. Their peaceful, trusting nature had shown him how to embrace life's rhythms without trying to control everything. Jacob realized that, like the birds, he didn't need to fix every problem. Instead, he needed to trust in God's plan and let go of his fears and doubts. As he knelt in the grass, Jacob felt a deep shift in his spirit. The weight of his struggles had lifted. He no longer felt burdened by the debts, the failing crops, or the loneliness that had once overwhelmed him. His heart was light, his mind at peace. The birds had guided him back to his true self, and through them, he had reconnected with his faith. Standing up, Jacob felt a newfound sense of freedom. He no longer needed to control every outcome. The land around him felt different now, infused with a quiet energy, as if it too had been transformed. He had learned to trust again, to let go, and to live in harmony with the world around him. The struggles that once seemed insurmountable no longer had power over him. Jacob walked back to his house, his heart full of peace. He knew the birds had come for a reason, not just to save his farm, but to help him save himself. He was no longer alone in facing life's challenges. With renewed faith, patience, and gratitude, Jacob felt ready for whatever the future held. For the first time in years, Jacob felt at ease. The miracle wasn't in the birds, but in his transformation. He was finally at peace with his life, trusting that no matter what came next, he would face it with grace and faith. Jacob's farm began to thrive again. The crops grew abundantly, and his once dry well now flowed with water, nourishing the land. His debts, once overwhelming, began to ease as he was able to sell his crops and make payments. The land felt alive with new energy, and Jacob's approach to farming shifted. No longer frantic and burdened, he worked with patience and care. His newfound wisdom came not just from hard work, but from the lessons he had learned: faith, patience, and trust in the process. He no longer viewed his struggles as obstacles, but as steps toward growth. Each evening, Jacob stood at the edge of his fields, grateful for how far he had come. The transformation of his farm mirrored his own journey. He had learned to embrace life with a calm heart and a renewed sense of purpose. Jacob stood in his flourishing fields filled with gratitude. The farm had come back to life, and so had he. His transformation had been gradual but profound. He had once been a man lost in despair, but now he understood the deeper meaning of his struggles. The miracle wasn't in the birds or the eggs, but in the faith they helped him rediscover. He felt at peace with his life, no longer burdened by the need to control everything. Jacob realized that life was about trust, patience, and acceptance. The birds had shown him that he didn't need to fix every problem. He simply needed to have faith. As Jacob looked out over his fields, he knew he was ready for whatever life would bring. He had learned to live with grace and peace, and his life was now a testament to the quiet miracles that unfold when we trust and believe.